Okay, I welcome to everybody who's here. Thank you very much for coming to the lecture. Marc Asnin is a New York photographer studying the visual arts, and he worked and published in numerous publications in Life magazine, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Sunday magazine. Has exhibited in many museums and galleries through the United States and Europe. Mr. Asnin has received from the Virginia Museum of Art residency program, and his work has received numerous awards. The most notable is the Eugene Smith Grant in Humanitarian Photography. In a publication, Uncle Charlie, which just have been done, he was awarded with the Robert Kennedy Journalism Award. I think that anybody can has see the work in the gallery. You can see the enthusiasm and especially the magnificent photography that he produced, composition-wise, and including as a meaningful photography. When you go to the exhibition, the ones that don't know how going, I invite you to go there. It's almost like a meditation about the actually people living today with all these difficulties in our society, in a reflection of our society. With anything else more, I wanted to introduce you Marc Asnin, which he has much more things to tell you than myself. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks, Marc. Okay. All right, thank you, everyone. Always, it's great to be here at QCC, and I want to thank everyone from the gallery, not only the show, which is the biggest exhibition of my work from this project. Without the support of QCC, the book wouldn't be the quality it is. So over the last 15 years, the gallery, the museum, the institution has been incredibly supportive. And I think when we think about documentary photography, there are very few places that support this kind of work over the last 30 years. You know, we all want to say, oh, 40 years ago, the world, it was a wonderful place for documentary photography. I mean, that's not really true. It's always been a struggle, and I want to thank you guys because without you, the project would have been much more difficult and the book wouldn't have been the great success it was. And I think a lot of you are from this institution, so you should really be proud that it's not only work, the institution's not only supporting work that's, hip or, whatever the time, what's happening at this moment. There's been a real respect of the tradition of how important documentary photography is to the society we live in, to the communities that this campus serves. So I think with that, when I think of myself as a documentary photographer, I think of myself as a storyteller. I'm telling a story visually. With the Uncle Charlie book, there's a huge narrative. Uncle Charlie shared his life with me over 31 years. Out of those 31 years, approximately 26 years I recorded him, and in the final book and in the exhibition, those words are his words. For me, that really is the ultimate success of the project, is that we collaborated and he was able to, in his voice, tell his story. So here you're looking at a PDF of the book. When you're reading the narrative, the typography was a huge consideration in how the book, what designer I was going to collaborate with, and the way Uncle Charlie would sort of tell his story through the interviews, I think typography-wise, in the design, that's sort of how Uncle Charlie talks. It's almost sort of like a little like poetry. It's always broken up. It's not he didn't sit down and write the narrative. So I think the typography for me really expressed sort of how Uncle Charlie speaks. So I think in this day and age, it's not interesting for me as a storyteller, as a photographer, just to be able to express myself just with photos. So if I was just showing you these photos and I wasn't here, I could tell you all the Uncle Charlie stories. But if you're reading the book, or if you're looking at the book, you would know really nothing just from the photos. It would be your interpretation of the moment, and you would all each take something probably different from that interaction with the book. But I think it's important that you're able to read the words of Uncle Charlie. I have a question for you, like a lot of times I will ask questions later, but do you think it's more valid to read the words of Uncle Charlie, or if, let's say, I wrote the narrative, if it was about me, what do you think's more interesting? I mean, there's no right answer, but I think those are we could also agree those are two very different things to read. The photographer's interpretation of the 31 years and the subject's interpretation. Uncle Charlie always used to say to me during the project, "You go home, I stay here." And he was right. Even though Uncle Charlie thought I was rich and I was living the life, which was not true. Like, I grew up in Sheepshead Bay, and my parents many years had to work 2 jobs, and I'm 53 and I'm still trying to figure out how to make a living. So, but he was right in the sense I wasn't living in Bushwick, Brooklyn. I wasn't living on Social Security disability with mental health issues, with 5 kids. I wasn't living through incredible violence and poverty, and this was just a few years after the big blackout where Bushwick during the 77 blackout lost 189 stores because of arson. Bushwick was one of the more ransacked neighborhoods during the riots of the blackout. Then Uncle Charlie lived through the crack epidemic, through AIDS, and all those things affected his life. So Charlie was right, I did go home. So for me, it's not interesting to hear, how Charlie's nephew and what I thought about his life. Also, you're hearing it through someone who not only in his adult life he had mental health issues, but it starts in his young childhood. I also think what's interesting is when you look at the book or you look at the exhibition and we're looking at a family, we all come from a family. We may come from non-traditional families. Like in my life, my wife was married once before, and my oldest daughter, so is not my biological daughter, but I've raised her since she's 2. So that's a non-traditional family. We live in a society now, and we could all disagree. Some of you may think, oh, it's another liberal speaker they have at the school, but I think America's a healthier place. That recently the U.S. Supreme Court overturned an Alabama decision saying 2 women couldn't adopt a kid. I think that's a healthier nation. I think when you look at this work, because it's a documentary, you can't get away from the world we live in today. This project may have started in 1981, and we may not have been talking about gay marriage or gay adoption. But today, if you're here and you're interested in social issues and you're interested in documentary photography or film, there are many issues in front of you. Like, there's a lot of young people here. Obviously, I'm older, I have different issues, but you're living through Black Lives Matter, you're living through a lot of really, really, really angry, uneducated white people voting for Donald Trump, okay? And that affects everyone. Now, I'm not out there taking pictures of those people. But in the late 80s, early 90s, I had photographed Nazi skinheads in the Klan because I saw that as a direct threat to the America it was a direct threat to the America I believed in. So I think when you're a documentary photographer, in many ways, you're not a historian in the sense of academia, but you definitely lived through those historic moments. And those young, angry white men who I was photographing in the late 80s and 90s are now photographing Donald Trump. I don't really have much empathy I have no empathy for people who are racist, but that doesn't mean you can't I understand from my life experiences as a documentary photographer why these people like Donald Trump. He's throwing them the red meat, they're uneducated, racists they're ignorant, they're not getting the proper information. And I think those are things you need to, if you're interested, like people out there now, instead of like, oh, these people are what they are, you could be documenting that and trying to expose where that's from. So when we talk about the non-traditional family, that deals with immigration, that deals with criminal justice. People, America has more people incarcerated than anywhere else in the world. When you really delve deep into Uncle Charlie, it's not really about poverty, which I first thought. That's about being like an investigative journalist telling a story. When I first photographed Uncle Charlie at 18, so I didn't do this when I was 40. And that's important for all the students or the faculty here. You can start this when your life project at 18. You don't have to be quote unquote grown up. I'm still not grown up. So I thought the Uncle Charlie project was about poverty. But what really was about, it was about my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandmother came from a very religious Jewish family. Her parents were immigrants. Again, immigrants, right? And she rebelled, like many of us do when we're young, and she married a Jewish gangster. Now, many of you may not know, but in the last turn of the century, there was a very large element of Jewish organized crime. So they were degenerates, they were in the streets, they were the same people, like 50, 60, 70 years later, there were people selling crack on the street. Jews were doing other things in the street, okay? And my grandfather was one of those people. And again, when we look, we need to understand our history so we can move forward. And as a documentary photographer, the more educated you are about your subject, the better images, the better story you're going to be able to tell. So today in America in 2016, many people don't know that history of the Jewish community. And my grandfather created, and unfortunately at that time, women had less power, and my grandmother wasn't feeling she was empowered to stop that process, created an incredibly unhealthy home. So my mother, uncle, they were put to do illegal things. They had to run numbers. My mother was 5 years old at the liquor store every morning. In those days, they would call them winos. My mother lived in a predominantly black neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, and she ran numbers and did illegal things for my grandfather for Italian organized crime that my grandfather was like an associate of. When I was doing this book, I researched and I saw an editorial in the Daily News, and it was by the New York City Police Commissioner. And he said the greatest problem facing the city of New York was the Jews, that the Jewish scourge, something had to be done about the Jewish problem. That's the same kind of ignorance at that last turn of the century as you have people today, not only Donald Trump, but other people who are saying you need to round up 11 million people and deport them. It's no different. So again, if you want to be a good storyteller, you must understand history, because history repeats itself in many ways in a bad way. So I think for me, that's part of what my story, there's the photographic part of it, but there's the deeper part of Uncle Charlie that's to create more informed, better citizenship, better storytellers, better artists. So, looking at ourselves. So instead of, if I was a photographer today, really, instead of condemning all these people who are racist, like this guy who sucker punched this young gentleman in Cleveland the other night, like, he's an angry white man. I want to understand that anger. Not that I'm going to give him a free pass because he broke the law, but the better I understand that, I won't become them. Because they're not willing to understand what we are or what other people are. So again, in the beginning of the book, we're using archival material. The book starts out more about where Uncle Charlie came from. Pictures of my mother and Uncle Charlie. Okay. So you're thinking, like, I thought he was a photographer. Okay. So when I talk about Uncle Charlie and his stories, my father sat by the window waiting for Godot to come, but Godot sent his messenger, meaning Charlie. Okay, so Uncle Charlie, in the 31 years that I photographed him, never really had a book in his house. That's because there was no disposable income. Uncle Charlie wasn't going to the library. He was basically housebound. But Uncle Charlie, in his earlier years in school, read Waiting for Godot. And the rest of Uncle Charlie's life, what he did was he used that to sort of shape and justify his life. So when you read the book, you start realizing all these interconnections to his father. He in many ways lived his life out like my grandfather. My grandfather wound up going from a wise guy to a person here at my mother's wedding who was a stroke victim, who then drank himself to death sitting by a window. Charlie wound up housebound, many ways sitting by a window. The same dynamic. But without investigating, all I knew was Uncle Charlie was poor when I was a kid. All I knew was my mother was poor. There was the denial of the truth. The truth was too hard, and my mother just let it go. But as I started investigating and photographing Uncle Charlie, and he was telling me all these stories, my mother ultimately opened up and said, those stories are true. I just let it go. So it's about keeping open-minded in the process of making pictures and doing a story to see where that story goes. This was the first image when I was in art school and I was in a class, personal expression, that the teacher said, this is what you're supposed to do. If you do this, you're going to be successful. For most of us, we know you make a great picture one day, you may not make a great picture for many. It's not a process where it's straight ahead. It's like the stock market. You go up, you go down. The creative process is not a straight line. So I kept going through that process. Some of you are here at school learning, you're in that process. That is a difficult process. It's an incredibly rewarding process. So going through art school, you can, in personal expression, most of the people in that class were looking at their own sexuality. They were looking at other things. There was only one other student in the class that was seeing personal expression as a documentary. So I would take classes and hijack them for like how to deal with the stories that I wanted to do. Because I went to art school, they didn't really have like a specific class in documentary photography. I think going to art school for me was a great experience because compared to, let's say, friends of mine who went to journalism school, I think there's a very different approach to the photographic process, the composition, lighting, just how you make images. When the project was done over 31 years, there were a lot of photographs to look at. And I think at that point, there's two schools of thought. Do you just put in the best pictures, the pictures that you would think are A+, or do you have a different editing process where you put some pictures in that maybe be Bs or C+, because you believe they have to help tell the story? I think coming out of art school, I only put in what I thought were my A+ pictures. I think the narrative helps fill in the places that I missed. So I made a lot of C+ pictures, believe me. Many more C pictures than A+ pictures. Anyone who tells you they make A+ pictures all the time, that's not how it works. So to me, it's like being a baseball player. If you hit 300, that means only 3 out of 10. In most professions, if you only do 30%, you're fired. In baseball, you get big bucks. So for me, if I was able to hit close to 300 when it came to the final Uncle Charlie book, I think that's pretty successful. In the final book, I think out of 31 years, there's 167 pictures, which is an incredible tight edit. It comes to like something like 5 pictures. I'm not good at math because I went to art school, but it's a very tight edit. I think you learn as an artist, as a photographer, everything is, you have to get beyond the point that everything's precious to you. And that's not easy. That's why if you're formally educated, that's what your instructors are there for. If you're not formally educated, if you're working with your peers, people that you respect, you need to get beyond everything you do is precious. Now, some of you come from homes your parents tell you you're incredibly precious, and that's better than if your parents tell you you're screwed up, for sure. But the reality is not everything we do is precious, and that's a difficult balance. But that's the hard part, how to get there. I was looking at the dynamic of the 5 children. Uncle Charlie had 5 children with 1 woman. There's definitely the moment we've been taught throughout the history of documentary photography about the decisive moment, where you're there recording it with a camera, and boom, that's the moment. Now, some of that's a lie, because even though we were taught that for 50, 60 years in photo history and in books, the very famous French kiss, which is a picture of a couple at a cafe, which was told to generations of students, it wasn't a decisive moment. There were models, and in a French lawsuit in a court, it was proved that it was a staged moment. That's for another discussion, but that is a fact. I think it's my responsibility to you, to tell you my process. So if you see the book, you'll never really know. It's about you thinking about it. My cousin wasn't standing there, okay? This is his home. I placed him in that window. Because to me, it's an interpretation of his loneliness as a young boy in this setting. Now, you could say this is a travesty. QCC shouldn't have Marc show. He controlled the situation. But not that I'm an educator here, but I do believe it's my responsibility in a lecture setting to be straight. You can go back to your classes, you can go home, you can tweet about it, whatever you do, and that's open for discussion. But I would put forward to you that many, many images that you have seen historically are images that there is some control. Now, that is different than I had a teacher who did a story about male prostitution in Times Square when Times Square was, a place of strip joints, topless joints, prostitution. It wasn't Rudy Giuliani's Times Square. And there was definitely pressure between the young male prostitutes. They wanted to be the main subject of his story. And this young male prostitute came to Stephen and said, I'm going to give you the best picture that you ever can imagine. You come tomorrow to 42nd and 8th Avenue. I'm going to go on the subway with you, and I'm going to jump in front of a subway car. There's a huge difference of putting my cousin in a window or asking someone or participating in someone's suicide. Now, there are photographers that may participate in that. Those are all very moral discussions, but I also don't want you leaving thinking that documentary photographers are so pure, because that's just not true. And when we talk about the purity of making images, like here's like an early image. This is not about the purity, but I was very interested in like still lifes. Later in the project, you'll see other images that I would call my still lifes, little details that also tell you things about their lives. We look for iconic things in people's homes. So here on the left is a picture of John F. Kennedy, cut out of Life magazine after the president was assassinated. That's the only time Uncle Charlie ever voted for president. Now, I don't sort of buy his whole story that was the end of America. I think he used that to fit into his personal life. On the right is a picture of like some kind of mirror picture of Jesus. God bless our home. That is throughout the text. You see how an interreligious marriage wound up becoming a huge problem. Many difficulties between Charlie and his wife later on when his son was dying from AIDS and how he would be buried. So we're looking for different things in the home. When people are wearing, certain jewelry, things that tell you iconic, images, iconic things in their home. So every few pages, we keep getting connected to his words, using drawings that Uncle Charlie did at his mental health clinics early on in the project. What pictures go together? The sequencing of the book, obviously, is a very important process. Again, when we go back to the family, on these two pages, we look and read that Charlie molested his stepdaughter. At some points, he raped her. He didn't molest her, he raped her. She was a minor, he raped her. This little Polaroid here on the right is him in the foreground, and she's in the back. That was something I found in, let's say a shoebox. So you're always looking to bring all these elements together. So again, one of the great things about having this exhibition here is that with Lisa writing the grant for the NEA and getting it, a grant from the NEA, I'm participating with a public high school in Queens, an art school, and they're creating in 3 different classes, one a photography class, one a portrait class, a drawing class, and a class in design. They're working on their families and their approaches. And in the photo class, the teacher has, like, one student went to his mother and said, I want to do a story about you. And she said, no, you should do your father and his battle with alcoholism. And the father is totally giving his all to his son. And in high school, that's not very easy to have to expose your father's an alcoholic. Or another young woman is sharing how she came across the border, the Mexican-American border, at 2 years old illegally, and her family struggle to create a new life in America, and what a good life now she has with her family. Her story is really important because her story proves that even though they came here illegally, they're a vibrant part of the American society. It wasn't, believe me, historically, Hispanics were not the first people to come here illegally, okay? Lucky Luciano, that's an Italian surname, who helped create organized crime, he was deported during World War II because he came here illegally, okay? So I think it's a great opportunity, and those students are going to have an exhibition here, I think in May or June. And more important than coming to my exhibition, I really hope you can all, through social media, any means you have, help support these young students, because they're going to have a show in a beautiful space. And what they're getting from me is I told my story, and their story is just as valid and just as important. And in many ways, it's more important today because they're telling stories that are relevant today. And that kid, that young man who's telling a story about his father, who's an alcoholic, who now is recovering, and the father, I think, was really physically hurt in an altercation when he was drunk. That student at 17, 18 has much more strength than I ever had doing Uncle Charlie. Because remember, I went home. He's living it. So it's really inspiring to share my work with them and to see that they're embracing hard issues. So I'm going to help try to get the word out, and I hope you do too. When you're doing a project like this, I didn't know until much later in the project that my uncle raped his stepdaughter. It wasn't like she's a little younger than me. 10 minutes, okay. So it wasn't like I covered that up. The other interesting thing is when you enter into these kinds of projects is why do you... Yesterday, CUNY TV interviewed me here, and they asked me, why did Uncle Charlie share this with you? I'm not really sure, even after being around him now 35 years in a very concentrated relationship. On one level, I was the only guy listening. He didn't have the ability to share that with his wife. And again, when we talk about, here's his wife. In 1987, she abandoned Uncle Charlie and left him and his kids. It's very quickly, and listen, I judged her, and I'll still say you never abandon your children. But that is a judgment, which maybe I shouldn't be in a position of doing. But again, trying to understand, this was her second husband. She had 2 kids with her first husband who beat her and left her deaf in one ear. She married Uncle Charlie, had another 5 kids. Now, I don't know if that's responsible in the sense of birth control, but that was, and then she left. I think as a storyteller, a journalist, whatever you want to call yourself, the more you can try to understand the person's situation, the better off you are. But don't think, I mean, most of you are younger, some of you are closer to my age, or you are my age. There was many years in school they told you journalism is totally, you must be objective. That's not true. That was another myth they taught you in school. And one time I presented my work at a school, and the teacher used to be at UPI, which was like AP News. And when I said something like, oh yeah, these skinheads are blah, 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 and none of that was really nice, he asked me to leave the class because he told the class that journalists didn't give their opinions. We don't live in a shell. So when I was hanging out with skinheads and Nazis, I didn't do it because I was Jewish. I didn't do it to formulate. I went in there open-minded, but unconsciously, consciously, the pictures may tell a different story. You know, when you're photographing a skinhead, and I was photographing him shaving his head, and then he said, oh, I'm going to take a shower. Now, they're incredibly homophobic, but I asked him, oh, can I photograph you in the shower? And he said, oh, yeah, because for them, it's ego. It's 15 minutes of fame. And when he was in the shower and the room was all steaming up, there's no way I didn't think of 6 million Jews being told you're going to get to the shower, and then they were gassed or exterminated in different ways. And when I was in that shower in the room, I thought about snapping his neck for the 6 million of my people. I didn't, but that is the thought I had. And so I think we are people. You know, you go into these situations, and I saw recently on CNN, an African-American journalist went and he interviewed Klansmen. You know, the first time I went to a Klansman house in Connecticut, he was the biggest Klans leader in America, in Connecticut. And when I went to the door with the writer and I said, oh, hi, Mr. Farrens, my name is Marc Asnin, he said, oh, you're a fucking Jew bastard. You know, and I said, no, I'm actually I'm Italian from Brooklyn, because Asnin is not a typical Jewish last name. So this all goes back to not judging and trying to understand, you know, and my aunt, she left, and she left Uncle Charlie in a very complicated situation. Eventually, Charlie, he gets out of bed, and at that moment when he's trying to help raise his kids, the crack epidemic comes to America and to New York. And his life again is changed by all these women who are addicted to crack. Here's a picture where one of my cousins went to a mental hospital. And I snuck in and I made pictures in Kings County Mental Hospital. We only have a few minutes left. I think the other thing that I just want to leave you with is when you do stories, there are consequences sometimes to doing stories. So photographing skinheads in the Klan was complicated, to say the least, for security reasons and sort of the pressure that you're under. For young people here who ever think about becoming a photojournalist and going to cover war, the consequences of war is you can really die. There's nothing, my friend died at 27 years old in Iraq. He was about to go to Yale Law School. He had went to Harvard. He was an immigrant from Romania who was living the American dream. His mother got them out of communist Romania, moved to Germany, got him to go to Harvard, was about to go to Yale to be a human rights lawyer. He had the urge to tell the story about the Kurdish people who were being massacred in the first Gulf War, who had been gassed earlier by Saddam Hussein. He was executed in Kurdistan, and that was the end of him. And you know what? No one here knows his name. All the assholes in the photo world. There were 3 eulogies. I was part of it. I went to Harvard. I went to the Harvard Club. I went to International Center of Photography. I was the guy who gave the eulogy for the photography agency he was in. No one knows him. It's not a game. There's nothing sexy when you're watching on HBO a movie about, Sean Penn being a war journalist. Also, my own personal experience on 9/11, I wound up 100 feet from the North Tower, and I wound up under a fire truck with a fireman as the North Tower imploded. It wasn't a war, it was a war zone, but you didn't think of it as that day. We were under attack. And I almost didn't come home, and I almost screwed my wife and screwed my 3 daughters. So there's something you need to think about those consequences. The consequences, now you could decide you want to be a war journalist. That's for you to figure out, but it's nothing to be thought about lightly. When you're doing a story like Uncle Charlie, the consequences in this project were, at the end of the 31 years, one of my cousins passed away, but the 4 remaining hate me. They hate me because I exposed to the world their very complicated lives. I think they're also more than the pictures, it's the words. Now, I was the one who curated those words. They're Uncle Charlie's words. But that is a major consequence. I'm not in the CUNY the other day, TV interview, he asked me, did I regret it? Was it worth it? I'm not standing here and saying my life was changed by Uncle Charlie project. I became someone very different from where I came from. It gave me a lot of opportunity. I don't regret it, but I'm conscious of what happened. I wasn't aware of that then, and I don't think teachers of mine sort of shared that with me. And the last thing is, when you're going to create something, I think there's something to think about, and many journalists don't think about this, or I don't know journalists, but a lot of documentary photographers or photojournalists, they're like gorillas, they bang on their chest, how they're changing the world and they're so righteous. The person that most benefited from the Uncle Charlie project was me. Not because I'm selfish. I think that ultimately, in the end, happens in most of these projects. Uncle Charlie, it's true, he got to tell his story. So when Uncle Charlie goes to Woodhall Hospital, which is a city hospital in Bushwick, he's a big guy there. They all know there's a 400-page book about Uncle Charlie. And my wife once said that she thought I owed it to Uncle Charlie to publish the book before he died, because he had given so much that he deserved to have the book. Which I'm not saying is right or wrong, but that's something she had shared with me. So Uncle Charlie did get something. He got to tell his story that he never told. But I didn't change the world. I changed some people's lives, and maybe in the school in Queens, the art school that I'm working with, it helps affect some people. But when Ethel Kennedy calls you on the phone and invites you to Washington to give you an award in her husband's name, and in some of those things, that didn't really help my cousins. Now, I'm not saying the project was there to help my cousins. I think that's something they don't understand, but I think it's a lot to think about. So I appreciate it. I know we didn't get through a lot of pictures, but you can go to the show. I'm going to actually, somehow we're going to figure out how the gallery will have a PDF of the book. So for people who can't afford to buy the book, we're going to figure out, I'm going to talk to Lisa and Grace on how to make sure that's somewhere that you can come and read the PDF of the book, or you could steal the book somehow, whatever. All right, thank you. Yes?
Does Charlie have any relationship with his 4 remaining children?
No, basically he has no relationship to them. Once in a blue moon, like he'll go to the hospital, he gets like a stent put in his heart, which is a procedure. And he asked me to come, and 2 of his kids showed up. So that wasn't like, I eventually left. I was happy they were there for him. But on a daily, weekly, monthly level, no, they really have nothing to do with him. I was pretty clear with him that I thought a lot of the words that were in the narrative were going to be more detrimental to his relationship to them. And I suggested him, we would work together to take some of those things out. Now, I edited it with like another editor, but a few things he demanded on keeping in there that now I think their relationship was finished by then, but that was the last act. He created the landscape, but sadly, like my mother came from the same kind of dysfunction, but my mother she used to tell me, yeah, that all sucked, but when I became the adult, I created the new relationship with my mother, meaning my grandmother, and she figured out somehow to make the next part of her relationship with her mother a really healthy one. I think, and they were successful. We had a very healthy relationship. Sadly, my cousins, none of them were able to say, okay, that sucked, and I'm going to recreate something healthy. I think my grandmother was a healthy, good person, and maybe that was easier for my mother. But yeah, it's a sad story, I mean, he's alone. And the only thing that he's only interested in is like, how will he be buried? Because he thinks their last act of vengeance towards him will not to bury him as a Jew. Like that they'll be, but he's very manipulative, I mean, years ago someone said, you're not very understanding or you're not very nice to your uncle, for a bunch of reasons. And I was like, be careful. Like this was someone I knew from school and somehow she went to visit him. And I just reminded him like he's mentally ill. It's a very sad story, but he's also very Brooklyn. He also understands all the manipulative games he learned from from my grandfather. And be careful, like he's there to manipulate you. It's just not, I'm a sad old man. Recently in the book, a big part of his childhood was he was about to be bar mitzvahed like every 13-year-old Jewish boy, but they couldn't afford to continue to send him to Hebrew school for the $1 a day twice a week in the 1950s. So what happened was they didn't have his bar mitzvah, but they told everyone they did, and they scammed it so they could buy a used television. It stayed with him his whole life. He talks about it in the book that there was major baggage. It was the biggest scam he learned. Years later, he did this Jewish ceremony with this group in Crown Heights that I had photographed. So it represented his bar mitzvah at 66 years old. He was officially had his bar mitzvah. He was moved, it's in the book, he's so happy. But then he wants the young rabbi to come visit him because he thinks the young rabbi's an easy guy to shake down for money. Because he thinks he's a religious guy, he's not smart. So, it's complicated. So it's, with my cousins, he's still trying to shake everybody down, I mean.
Anyone else?
I was late 20 minutes, but maybe you already talked about it. But in your statement, you said you are not the only one document Uncle Charlie's life. So what's the other people document his life?
No, I mean, I don't know what that statement is, but yeah, I'm the only one who ever photographed my uncle. Yeah, I mean, officially, yeah, I'm the only one. There were, I mean, this no one would know. Like, he would go to Woodhull Hospital and he told me, oh, this woman who works there, her sister's a photographer for National Geographic, and I decided I'm going to sell my story to her and I'm going to screw you. Which I said, fine, like, good luck. I hope you have a good experience with it, because it's the game. It's the game also with my uncle. So, yeah, I mean, maybe there is someone else who photographed Uncle Charlie, which I don't know, which good luck to them, but yeah, I'm the only one. Maybe, yeah, for sure, I'm the only one.
So it is said here, I'm not the first guy to document
Oh.
family. Yeah,
It's family, right. So not my, meaning I'm not the first person. It's like I didn't create a movement to document my family. There's many other photographers who have documented their families. I think here it's unique that I did it for 31 years. I was inspired by a photographer I met in the mid-'80s who documented a town in upstate New York for 20 years. And it, you know, it's sort of a dying small town. You see this very much in, you know, in the Midwest or in, like, you know, North Dakota, these disappearing little towns. He had photographed it in a very different way, but I thought that was my inspiration about looking at Charlie for 20 years to see what would happen to his family. It took me 31 years to figure it out. Yeah.
What about Charlie is so compelling that you have to take 31 years to provide him?
Right. So, as my friend said, like, how could you spend 31 years in a room with one man? Like, what's wrong with you? Clearly, when I was a young kid, I was very attracted to Uncle Charlie. Growing up in Brooklyn, Uncle Charlie was the tough uncle, tattooed. If there was a problem, Charlie would be, like, once my father was a photographer, you know, the camera store money, and the camera store called, it was the 1960s, and they threatened my mother. My uncle, now my father was definitely Brooklyn, and my other uncle, Frankie, went to the camera store and they grabbed the owner over the counter and told them, you called the wrong family. Okay, like, I grew up in Brooklyn where that was a good thing if you were a wise guy. Uncle Charlie, you know, once remember when I was a kid, he was driving me somewhere and he had like a gun in the glove compartment. That was attractive, you know? I mean, that's why you see movies like Goodfellas or, you know, whatever movies you see. That's why, you know, mainstream people are attracted to that. So I was definitely attracted to that. You know, when we talk about nature versus nurture, I don't know, was there something in, like, that so connected me to my uncle that I don't know later on. I also think I didn't have any siblings, and Uncle Charlie's kids were like my family. And when I sort of re-met him when I was sort of 17, 18, it was a very different Uncle Charlie. He was laying in bed, he was housebound, and I think at that moment, I was attracted to him as a story. You know, he was so different than the wise guy uncle I did. The process of 31 years, in the beginning I was in art school, I was trying to make a project, met this photographer who did a project for 20 years, and I thought 20 years was a really good time to see what would happen to my cousins. You know, when you're looking at work and you're affected by other creative people, there was a documentary called 7 Up, where they would look at 3 or 4, it was in England, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 people at 7, at 14, at 21, at 28, and what would happen to them, their dreams. So that was the idea of doing along. At 20 years, I had 3 kids, I had a wife, I had no more mother, I had a father I had to help take care of. It just took 31 years. There was not, and at 31 years, I was done. Like, there wasn't that much thinking about, there's no reason at 31 years. Maybe then I had met a filmmaker who was interested in making a film with me, and he said, yeah, we can't make the film until Charlie dies. And I thought, that's too obvious. And that's sort of when my wife said to me, I think you owe it to Charlie. And I thought the filmmaker had it wrong, that it was too obvious. And connecting to the Waiting for Godot thing, Charlie was always waiting. It wasn't about dying. It was about waiting for something that was never coming, and death was too obvious. Okay, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.